Welcome to the Invite Health podcast, where our degreed healthcare professionals are excited to offer you the most important health and wellness information you need to make informed choices about your health. You can learn more about the products discussed in each of these episodes and all that Invite Health has to offer at www.invitehealth.com/podcast. First-time customers can use promo code podcast at checkout for an additional 15% off your first purchase. Let's get started.
When it comes to aging, people are always looking for ways to try to combat this. And one of the first indications that we are aging usually tends to be maybe you see some changes in your skin, perhaps more pronounced wrinkles. But there's another key indicator, and that usually is when your hair starts to change, and in particular, when you start to see gray hair. Yes, the gray hair problem that people encounter sometimes in their 30s, sometimes in their 40s, sometimes people can even experience seeing gray hairs in their 20s. But whatever be the case, we certainly know that this can drive up a lot of alarm and concern for many people, and you're racing out to try and find something to cover up those grays. So today I want to talk about a particular supplement that can be very beneficial as part of your daily routine that can help to offset the reason why we start to have gray hairs popping up. So I am going to talk about that nutrient today in some detail and talk about the science behind it, not only when it comes to targeting the graying of the hair, but all of the other benefits that go along with daily use of this particular nutrient. So I am Amanda Williams, MD, MPH, and let's get right to it. Let's talk a little bit about gray hair. Yes, the notorious gray hair that people, the first time you see gray hair, you think, oh goodness, what in the world is happening? And how do I get this to stop? Like I said, most people's common remedy to this is to go out and to, get hair dye. And it's not just women. We know that there's the just for men formulations that are out there. So certainly men experience this issue and can be alarming as well. And men usually are trying to find ways that they can, once again, combat this. So I want to talk about Catalase, because Catalase is a naturally occurring endogenous, as we call it. So it's something that's naturally happening in the body. We call that endogenous. So we know that Catalase is one of our endogenous antioxidants. And like most of our other antioxidants, as we get older, if our endogenous antioxidant levels begin to plummet and we do not take proper measurements in terms of trying to replenish that, then we can certainly run into some problems, which is why taking Catalase as a supplement can be very, very helpful. Not only are we helping to replenish one of the most important antioxidants in the body, we are also addressing that underlying problem when it comes to graying of the hair. Now, we know that oxidative stress in the body, so anytime we have any type of reactive oxygen species or free radical, what happens is our endogenous antioxidants start to target that. And this is great. This is what they're meant to do. But sometimes those levels, once they go and they target that oxidative stress, they don't bounce back. And we see this oftentimes with Catalase. And Catalase being one of the crucial antioxidant enzymes that actually mitigates oxidative stress to a considerable extent. The way that it works is by destroying cellular hydrogen peroxide, and it converts it into water and oxygen. So hence, this is kind of that key point when we think about gray hair. So we know Catalase is targeting or destroying hydrogen peroxide buildup. So, and most people have heard of, the peroxide blonde and, how do you get your hair to become lighter and blonder? And people often say, well, what about peroxide? Well, what we know is that the body naturally produces, as this reactive oxygen species, hydrogen peroxide. So as hydrogen peroxide levels start to take over in the body, we see that end result in our hair, because what it's doing is it's bleaching out the hair. So hence your gray hair is coming from that excessive hydrogen peroxide. Now, what do we know controls hydrogen peroxide in the body? catalase. So if we have a deficiency or a malfunction in catalase, then we know that this can lead to the pathogenesis not only of the graying of the hair, but many other age-related or age-associated diseases. So we can even look at low catalase levels in things like diabetes and high blood pressure, in skin disorders such as vitiligo, in Parkinson's disease, in mood disorders such as bipolar, for example. So we know that having adequate catalase levels in our system throughout our lives can be very, very beneficial, not only for the vanity of not having so much gray hair pop out, but for all of those other reasons that I had mentioned, targeting all of the problems that can arise in any type of chronic disease state. And when you have higher levels of oxidative stress occurring within the body, which is why we want to make sure that we do have adequate catalase. It's kind of like when we look at ubiquinol. We always want to make sure that as we get older, we're continuously putting coenzyme Q10 ubiquinol into our system as part of a daily supplementation routine to offset the natural loss of coenzyme Q10 ubiquinol in the body. When we look at things like glutathione, for example, we know our endogenous production of glutathione begins to diminish as we get older. We know that there are certain conditions that exacerbate that loss of glutathione. Well, catalase falls into that same category. It's an endogenous antioxidant, means it's naturally occurring, but there are many reasons as to why that level can start to plummet off. And once it starts to plummet, there's no bringing it back unless we are putting it back in via supplementation. We know that oxidative stress is something that we do not want to have an overabundance of because we have seen this implicated in so many different metabolic and neurological disorders. So we definitely want to keep our antioxidant status at a good level so we can combat that, especially going through our older years. But let's talk a little bit about the premature graying and what happens when we don't have the ability to regulate excessive hydrogen peroxide buildup in the body. So in the PLOS One journal back in 2014, they were looking at this. They were looking at the consequence of compromised antioxidant activity in the actual hair bulb, and specifically, what they were looking at was catalase. And they said in a recent worldwide survey that roughly 74% of people between the ages of 45 and 65 years old have gray hair. So clearly this is a worldwide issue, and they were trying to figure out, what is the commonality in this? What is the mechanism in the functional breakdown that occurs, which is what they are seeing externally. So seeing the gray hair, but what's happening internally. And what they revealed was that catalase level and that low level of this antioxidant that's meant to regulate hydrogen peroxide buildup. When that level was low, they were seeing higher levels of graying of the hair. So it's a really quite interesting study, the way that they were assessing this, because they were looking at the hair bulb itself, and within the melanocytes, they were also assessing the actual antioxidant levels and the effects of low levels of catalase in particular really led to this profound change in terms of the discoloration or that lightening, hence the graying of the hair itself. So we're looking at the pigmented and unpigmented hair follicles, and the catalase was the main underlying factor to the degree of the graying of the hair. So we have seen this in multiple studies. So that's just one of the studies that I wanted to bring up. But I have worked with many people where, for whatever reason, they have concerns. Maybe they're like, hey, I don't like to see gray hair. What can I do? Or, hey, I don't want to be having to run out and put chemicals on my, hair, every 6 weeks to try and cover up the gray hair. What can I do? So I generally will lead them down that path of, hey, check out catalase, because catalase is something that we know is a natural antioxidant. But as we get older, and for many different reasons, chronic diseases, stress, all different reasons as to why catalase levels can start to diminish. If we can start to replenish that back up, we can oftentimes see a slowing of that effect that we see in the hair. So the gray hair becomes less and less when we start to maintain healthier levels of this very powerful antioxidant. Because why? Because now we're once again regulating that catalase pathway. And this is very, very important. In the journal that I was referring to, in the PLOS One journal, this was a very detailed study in which they were analyzing the actual hair follicles themselves. Now, we know from that they were looking specifically as the mechanism to how that depigmentation of the hair was occurring, and tying that direct causal effect to the catalase levels. Now, there was another study that was done all the way back in 2009 in talking about hair graying and hydrogen peroxide mediated oxidative stress and how this affects human hair color by actually blunting what's known as the methionine sulfoxide repair pathway. Now, this is kind of heavy in the science, but you've heard me before in the past talk about the importance of detoxification and methylation reactions, and we know that methionine is a key regulator into this. And we also look at the hydrogen peroxide buildup once again. So in this particular study, this is one of the things that they were able to once again see, was that higher levels of hydrogen peroxide, which was brought on because of that defective ability for the body to properly detoxify from that hydrogen peroxide. And part of the reason why it has that struggle is because of the lack of naturally occurring catalase. So all of these different things that we certainly know catalase plays a role into. And as I mentioned, I've worked with many people where once they start to use Catalase, they start to see that difference. They're like, wow, before it seemed like every time I looked in the mirror, I would see a new gray hair. Now that I've been taking Catalase, I'm not seeing, the same amount of gray hairs popping out, from week to week or month to month, and which is really important because not only are we benefiting the hair itself, but think about what we're actually doing truly at that cellular level by maintaining healthier hydrogen peroxide levels in the body. We don't want to have this high level of hydrogen peroxide circulating in our system day after day because that does a lot of cellular damage. So while we're seeing it coming out as gray hair, think about what it's doing before it gets to that point. And that's really quite alarming as well. So in the Biology and Chemistry journal in 2017, they were looking at catalase in a different light. So beyond that of what we know with, the impacts of the hair bulb and the hair follicle and the graying of the hair, they were looking at catalase as being a very powerful antioxidant in cancer treatments. So this is why I wanted to bring this up today, because I do think it has relevance. They said the catalase is this key enzyme that functions in the metabolism of hydrogen peroxide and reactive nitrogen species, and its expression and localization is altered in tumors. So once again, kind of really some interesting research here. They're finding that the molecular mechanism of catalase is really much more profound than they initially thought it to be. So they found in certain cancer cells that there are higher levels clearly of ROSs or reactive oxygen species, and it makes it very difficult for the body to manage that when we are lacking key antioxidants. And the main one that they focused in on in this particular research was catalase, and understanding that catalase can help to downregulate that negative impact of that cellular proliferation that occurs within cancer cells. So having higher amounts of catalase in the body, once again, was really working at that level of protection beyond what we had initially even recognized catalase to do. So when we talk about endogenous antioxidants, there are so many of them in the body. I had mentioned a couple earlier. Glutathione, we have our coenzyme Q10. Clearly, we can look at our things like superoxide dismutase, alpha-lipoic acid, for example. These are all naturally occurring antioxidants. And when those levels start to taper off or diminish, then we really run into a good amount of cellular damage. And we have to be able to mitigate that. And one of the best ways to go about mitigating that is via supplementation. So I always go to that simple kind of concept or theory. If we're deficient in something, the solution to that is to replenish that, or to replace what is lost. So if we know that through the aging process and through different disease states, we can lose our catalase levels in the body, then it would make sense to go ahead and supplement with Catalase. So our Catalase formulation is actually yielding you 600 milligrams of Catalase per capsule, which is a very good amount of Catalase to be putting back into the system each and every single day. Now, we partner this up with what is known as picrohiza. Now, the combination, picrohiza is a herbal extract, but when we combine our endogenous antioxidant Catalase along with the picrohiza, what we're doing is we are packing this power punch of antioxidant value to support every cell within the body, in particular when we really look at liver function. So we kind of go back to that methylation pathway and detoxification and the importance of that, and recognizing that when we have that blunted effect of the methionine and not having adequate amounts of catalase, we see what happens in the system. And we know that the liver is our primary detoxifying organ. So by putting in the higher amounts of catalase into the system, we once again regain that control to better regulate the hydrogen peroxide buildup in the system, at the same time to be able to target other reactive oxygen species that do this really high amount of cellular damage. So it's a really, really cool product, and not a lot of companies, really kind of delve into all of the ways in which Catalase can be incredibly supportive to the human body, which is why I think it's so cool that we actually offer this and all of the many different benefits that go along with this. And there was a journal up in Canada all the way back in the 80s. It was the Canadian Journal of Biochemistry and Cell Biology, where they were talking about, Catalase being studied for decades and looking at its physiological role in the body and how it has all of these different enzymatic functions. It's not only responsible for that breakdown of hydrogen peroxide into water and oxygen, but also recognizing that it was, playing this really pronounced role within the liver detoxification pathway too. So for me, I recognize all of the many different utilizations of key antioxidants, and Catalase to me is just one of those ones that stands out, because we know many people do have that vanity concern of, oh gosh, I'm getting gray hairs. What can I do? Catalase is always going to be my number one go-to when it comes to targeting that. But I also realize all of the other many benefits that you can yield by having daily supplementation of Catalase on board. So the liver detoxification pathways, fending off all of that oxidative stress that our bodies are exposed to on a daily basis, at the same time fending off those nasty little gray hairs. So that is all that I have for you for today. I want to thank you so much for tuning in to the Invite Health podcast. Remember, you can listen to all of our episodes for free wherever you listen to podcasts, or by visiting invitehealth.com/podcast. Do make sure that you subscribe and you leave us a review. You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Invite Health, and we will see you next time for another episode of the Invite Health podcast.